This is Snow Treasure, Chapter 15. The new snow was a sparkling white sheet that spread over everything. The windows of the houses had shaggy white eyebrows, and the doors were all but blocked up with dense woolly beards. The sunlight scattered handfuls of diamonds over the streets. In the yards were crystal prisms that showed every color of the rainbow where the sun touched the glittering white. Throughout Wiswick was a flurry of snow shoveling the day the blizzard was a flurry of snow shoveling the day the blizzard subsided. It commenced from almost the earliest light. On the way to the cave, Peter found the snow knee-deep in places. He would sink into it, but his light sled rode on top or would drop but a few inches below the crest. His team had the rare pleasure of making fresh footprints in the white world of the forest. Only the animals had preceded them, for Per Garson's skis cut across the hills where feet and sleds could not follow. So the new snow showed only the stars of small animal paws, and now and then a round spot where a rabbit may have sat on his haunches. After a time, Peter saw ski marks and noted that several pairs of snowshoes had traveled into the forest that morning. He had an uneasy feeling. The ski trail was not Per Garson's, for he would have come from an entirely different direction. Near the cave he picked up another trail that seemed to come in a great loop from behind the evergreens at the cave entrance. Then farther on, the loop sent off a shoot, the way a branch grows out of a tree. Peter was cautious about approaching the cave. Peter was cautious about approaching the cave. He was not going to walk into a trap. I think we're just keeping on sliding there. Let's try this. Okay. He was not going to walk into a trap. When he first came on the ski trail, he warned his team to silence. So the 10 of them moved over the snow as quietly as possible. Near the cave, he lined his boys and girls behind a thick clump of bushes that the new snow had made into a solid blot of white. Leaving them to guard his sled, he quietly followed the trail into the cave. He would not have been surprised to see gray-green Nazi uniforms inside, but instead there was only Per Garson wiping his forehead on his sleeve. Peter's stealthy approach was not lost on old Per. So you was frightened, eh? You think to come on the Germans. I should have told you it was only us. My accents are not very good. There are some snowshoe trails, too, down the gully beyond the Troll's Tree. Nah, not to worry about them. Miles and Ole made them. 1 hour more, then there'll be trails all the ways you can look of snowshoes, of skis, of just plain feet. No one could find the way here by following the marks you boys and girls make with your boots and sleds. Well, I didn't know, Peter said. I knew you had come across the valley, but I didn't think one pair of skis could make so many trails. And I didn't know about the snowshoes. I make the many trails myself. I make more when you go off. Per drew out a blue bandana handkerchief and wiped his running eyes. You thought the Germans knew already about the cave? Not yet, but we must be careful or they'll learn. So you and old Miles are making a lot of trails so they can't follow? Peter had to admire the forethought behind this. And why not? Without them, what could be easier than to know everything? As plain as the noses on their faces would be the way. From all the houses come footprints and sled marks. They all go to one place, to the woods. So if you're a German, what do? You follow the tracks and they lead you to a cave that is no cave at all, only what was put here by someone with something to hide. Well, what is there to hide? Nothing but these brown bricks. And what are these bricks for? They're not to build a wall. One doesn't wrap such bricks in brown covers. And they're not for the fire. It takes only a minute to slit open the covers. And what do you find? Why, just plain gold. Gold enough to pave the street. It was a long speech for Per Garson, longer than any Peter had ever heard from him. Nor was that all of it either. And if you think we're going to let the Germans have this gold just by following the footprints that go straight as arrows, you're mistaken, Master Peter. What a vast amount of detail this undertaking required. Why, the grown-ups thought of everything. Peter could not help being impressed with the precautions that were being taken to prevent discovery. He felt that his safety and that of all the children was being guarded to the utmost. He felt glad that he knew about this, but Per Garson did not allow him much time for reflection. Where's your sled? He asked sharply. Peter replied with a scurry through the door. It's all right, kids, he called. Come on and bring my sled. The storm hadn't destroyed the German barracks. This the children could see when they reached the lookout. Beaten by the wind and lashed by the sea, they still stood trim beside the fishing pier. One of the Nazi warehouses had suffered some damage, for a crew of workers was busy repairing its roof. The big fjord had been on a rampage because there was a wreckage along its shore. But whether it was German or Norse property that had been carried away, the children couldn't tell. The Nazis didn't know what to make of the storm, Helga decided when her team reached the point where the beach lay spread before her. Peter's team was already there. His boys and girls had launched and were about to start down the mountain to the Snake. They didn't know whether they'd be drowned like the people in the flood in the Bible, she said. They wouldn't have had time to build an ark. In any event, being housebound for 3 days hadn't improved the commander's disposition. Peter could see that from where he was watching. And there's a picture that they put in there. The head officer was standing up and down before the barracks, hands behind his back. He would now and again lift a leather riding crop to shake it at someone who displeased him. Even up at the lookout, they could hear the snarl of his voice. He's telling them they are stupid as Norwegians. Helga had studied a little German and was translating for her team. He says that the people of this country have better sense than they, for they build their houses for the crazy wild weather in this part of the world. You must think we have blizzards like this all the time, Peter cut in. Helga went on. He said that if he'd been there when the barracks were started, they wouldn't have had all this trouble. I guess the storm did them more damage than we know, Peter concluded as he gathered his team together for the final push to the Snake. Down on the beach, Peter had his first brush with the commandant. Big boy like you playing with a sled, he taunted. In Germany, you'd be one of Hitler's youth. You'd learn to march. You'd be on your way to being a soldier. Don't want to learn to march. Don't want to be a soldier like you, Peter said under his breath. I could use a boy like you, the commandant went on, to polish my boots and bring me shaving water. What about it, boy? Would you like to come live here in the barracks? Peter, of course, made no reply. The commandant strode over and stood directly above him. Seated on his sled, he began to be afraid the officer would yank him up by his coat. Speak, boy, are you dumb? But Peter had no word to say. He was too frightened to speak, even if it were not forbidden. Dumb, stupid cattle, you Norwegians, the commandant turned on his heel. You deserve to lose your country. You're too brainless to defend it. But we'll put an end to this sled riding. There's no sense in a whole community growing up in ignorance. On Monday, you go back to school. And now chapter 16. Peter chuckled to himself. The commandant didn't know that Mr. Anders, the schoolmaster, had joined the Norwegian army and had gone away to fight. There would be no school, no matter what the commandant ordered. But that was reckoning without that resolute individual. There would be school if a German officer had to teach it, the grown folks had been told. When they first heard of the new order, they sent a committee to tell the commandant about Mr. Anders, and such was his reply. When Peter came back from the Holmes farm the next day, he saw German soldiers posting notices throughout the town. They had nailed long white handbills to the church door and on the post office and on the very school itself. Now they were putting additional ones on the light poles. The handbills were printed in Norwegian. They said that all must go about their lives as before the German occupation. Fishing and canning must be commenced as soon as the weather permitted. The soil must be planted as fully as in former times. Above all, the notices told the children must return to school. Nothing more quickly demoralizes a civilian population than to have its children idle, the notices proclaimed. Peter watched the soldiers at work. Everything they did was neat and thorough. They brought their own tools, even to a short ladder. A corporal and a squad of 8 marched in a corner, saluted stiffly, and divided into groups. Thus they went about their tasks, informing the people of Ryswick the will of the German force of occupation. One of the soldiers was the blue-eyed private Peter had noticed the first day the Germans had come to Norway. He looked wistful then, and today seemed sadder than ever. It was as if he hated sending the children back to their books. Hello, he said shyly in Peter's own language. But of course Peter could not reply, and seeing him close, Peter thought he looked younger than the others. He would be 20 or 21 at the most, Peter fancied. To the children, the German uniform was a common enough sight, but among the grown folks it caused consternation. In truth, the Germans had stayed by themselves on the beach near their barracks, and only in rare instances had come up the mountains to the town. But if their appearance caused a commotion among the townspeople of Ryswick, they did not show it. They chose to act as if they did not know the Germans were there. The German soldiers stared frankly, but the Norwegians walked along the streets with their heads in the air. They finished their errands hurriedly and went to their homes and stayed there. Then the minute the soldiers marched out of town, they began coming out of their houses. They gathered around the notices to study the new orders. There was a little procession to the pastry shop, the conditorry. Peter saw his mother coming out of their house. He stacked his sled against the wall and ran to join her. The notice, Mother, you've read it? It says school must open on Monday. Yes, I know. Mrs. Lundstrom quickened her steps. Inside the conditorry, a little knot of people had already gathered. They had come not so much to order the inviting-looking sandwiches, nor the delicious little ice cakes and pie crust goodies, as to discuss this latest order. But there was no need for anyone to say aloud the question that was first in their thoughts. With school reopened, how are we going to get the gold to the Snake? Mrs. Lundstrom felt they should be careful about discussing it and warned the others to caution. The soldiers had barely left town. They might return. I'll take a dozen of your raisin cookies, Fru Flack, she said. And do be careful, she was saying when the door actually did open and in came a Nazi recruit, that you wrap them carefully, she finished plainly. The soldier was the blue-eyed private who had said hello to Peter. He only wanted a smorgasbord. He chose one of the open egg and herring sandwiches and asked for a cup of coffee. Then he took a seat at one of the tables by the wall, his back to the woman at the counter. Fur Flack brought him his order. He began to eat his smorgasbord slowly at first and then more rapidly. With his entrance, the many busy tongues were stilled. Not a single syllable had been spoken the entire time he was there. When his own words died away, there was complete silence. As if he realized that all eyes were on his back, he ate his sandwich and tried to drink the steaming coffee. But it was too hot. After a couple of mouthfuls, he pushed aside the cup, rose, and took his leave. See, Mrs. Lundstrom stretched out her hands. I don't want to spoil your day's sales, Fru Flack, but I think it would be better if we talked about this in our homes. Peter picked up the box of pastries his mother had bought and followed her out the door. But she did not go home as she had advised the others to do. She walked along the diagonal of the town square to the opposite side and beyond to the home of Dr. Aker. She lifted the brass knocker. Marta, the housekeeper, smiled in welcome. Yes, the doctor was home. Would Fru Lundstrom and Peter come in? They entered the doctor's study, cheerful with its chintz-covered furniture and shining hearth brasses. Dr. Aker gave them a cordial welcome. Come sit down. His good face shone only a little less brightly than the Anderons. I don't know what that word means. I'll have Marta brew you a cup of tea. Mrs. Lundstrom dropped into a deep chair. The doctor drew up for her. Peter sat down beside her on a stool. And how are you, doctor? She asked as he fussed over the fire. Never better, Fru Lundstrom. I think the blizzard did a lot of good to my old bones. I tell you, I feel spry. That's just what happened to Per Garson, Miss Lundstrom said. He complained constantly before the storm. Now he never mentions any pains. Well, we old people have a way of feeling things that you young ones know nothing about. It's sort of an added sense. Is there any sickness in town, doctor? Mrs. Lundstrom asked. I must say, Fru Lundstrom, Wisbech has never had a healthier winter. I think the long cold is beneficial. It seems to have killed the germs. But I saw you going out during the blizzard. I thought someone must be very sick to get you out on such a day. It was only to see Granny Gola. The poor soul gets pretty lonesome living by herself. She's always so glad for company, so I make it a point on seeing her twice a week. It was my day to go, and I didn't want to disappoint her. Peter's mother returned to the subject of illnesses, but the doctor disclaimed any for the town. I tell you, Fru Lundstrom, a doctor has a hard time getting along in Ryswick. A healthier community you won't find anywhere on earth. The housekeeper brought in the tea tray, and Miss Lundstrom filled the role of hostess in pouring out. There was buttered toast and strawberry jam, Peter saw with pleasure. You've been out today, doctor? You read the notice? Mrs. Lundstrom asked. Yes, I read it when I went for my walk. A good thing, too. I thought it's best to keep the people busy, especially the children. But Dr. Aker, going back to school will stop, Peter began. Peter, his mother silenced him. But there was something in Dr. Aker's face that told him he understood what Peter had started to say. I'd quite forgotten about that, he said. I'd forgotten what reopening the school will mean. After school is too late, I suppose. Mrs. Lundstrom stirred her tea. The wood cracked in the fireplace. Wait a minute, Fru Lundstrom, the doctor set his cup precisely on the tea tray. You were asking about the sick. Now, I'm not sure I told you the whole truth. You see, we doctors don't like to alarm the townsfolk, but in winter one can always expect some sickness. And widespread sickness amounts to an epidemic, Mrs. Lundstrom added. And during an epidemic, one always closes down the school, Dr. Aker finished. An epidemic. Yes, if they had to make one. And that was the end of chapter 15 and 16 of Snow Treasure.